Welcome everybody to meeting number 3 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance. Pursuant to the House of Commons Order of Reference adopted on December 2nd, 2021, the committee is meeting on Bill C2, an act to provide further support in response to COVID-19. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. So you are aware the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. Today's meeting is also taking place in the webinar format. Webinars are for public committee meetings and are available only to members, their staff, and witnesses. Members enter immediately as active participants. All functionalities for the active participants remain the same. Staff will be non-active participants and can therefore only view the meetings in gallery view. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind all participants to this meeting that screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. Given the ongoing pandemic situation in light of the recommendations from health authorities, as well as a directive on of the Board of the Internal Economy of October 19, 2021 to remain healthy and safe. All those attending the meeting in person are to maintain 2-meter physical distancing, must wear a non-medical mask when circulating in the room, and it's highly recommended that the mask be worn at all times, including when seated. Must maintain proper hand hygiene by using the provided hand sanitizer at the entrance of the room. As the chair, I will enforce these measures for the duration of the meeting and thank members in advance for their cooperation. To ensure an orderly meeting, I'd like to outline a few rules to follow. 1, members and witnesses may speak in the official languages of their choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. If interpretation is lost, please inform me immediately and we will ensure the interpretation is properly restored before resuming the proceedings. The raised hand feature at the bottom of the screen can be used at any time if you wish to speak or alert the chair. For members participating in person, proceed as you usually would when the whole committee is meeting in person in a committee room. Keep in mind the Board of Internal Economy's guidelines for mask use and health protocols. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. If you are on the video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. Those in the room, your microphone will be controlled as normal by the proceedings and verification officer. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. With regard to a speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do the best that we can to maintain consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they are participating virtually or in person. And I'd like now to welcome our witnesses. We have heard already opening statements from these witnesses. They are the same witnesses that were at our second meeting earlier this morning. So we are going to proceed directly to our question time. So for the first round of questions, which will be 6 minutes to each member, we are going to start with the Conservative Party, and I believe it's Mr. Chambers for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr.
You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again to our witnesses who are so gracious with their time today. I'd just like to pick up perhaps where we left off, or where I left off last round, with respect to those individuals who may receive benefits who are ineligible, whether they're ineligible by virtue of program design or ineligible for reasons of fraud or otherwise or suspicious behavior. How many post-verification checks have been made against applications by applicants, and how many applications have been rejected based on these verification checks, post-payment verification checks? I understand there's pre-payment verification checks, which is a relatively easy hurdle to overcome, but a post-payment verification check audit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chambers, for the question. I understand that your question relates to the previous Canada Recovery benefit. or
Yes.
other benefits?
Yeah, I would include
Yes.
the CRB and the wage subsidy benefits as well. Thank you.
Okay, so to be able to provide you an answer on these particular aspects of post verification, which are not under my purview, this is something that, from an ESDC perspective, we would need to follow up on, perhaps with our colleagues at CRA. We do not this is not something that we would have under our purview. I could talk about the upfront verification processes that are being proposed in the context of the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit, but not the outcomes of the post verification processes that were implemented for the past benefits.
Thank you. Is that the same answer for the CEWS recipients?
Yes, that would be. We would have to confirm with our counterparts at the Canada Revenue Agency to get that information.
Okay, thank you. So perhaps I'd like to request, or I would request, that for this committee, as a member of this committee, in order to diligently ensure we are reviewing this legislation appropriately and that we understand the process, because as we heard earlier, it is the same verification process this time as it was last time, would like an answer to those questions in terms of how many post-verification checks have been completed and how many applicants have been rejected based on those checks. And then, in addition, could we please outline and document the specific steps for both verification periods? So what are the steps that the applicant must take for pre-verification? What are the steps the government has to take for pre-verification? And then what are the steps that the government must take for post-verification of audit of applicants for both or for all the programs, so CRB and CEWS? Separately, since we have been talking about, and an honourable colleague raised earlier, some questions around recipients of CEWS who pay dividends and increased executive compensation and repurchase shares. It would be very helpful as a member for this committee, and I think for all of our members here, to get a list, to receive a list in short order of those recipients of CEWS, including the time period for which the applicant applied. That would be very helpful in my duties on this committee, and I think would be relevant for other members of this committee as well. Is that something that we could agree to providing? And that would, for the list of the CEWS recipients, like in an easy format like Excel, would be very appreciative. Silence may be acquiescence. Is that?
We will take this back. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. We will take this back and see what. We will take the questions back and see what can be added to provide the answer.
Okay, and as we're
provide the detail requested.
Thank you. And as we're well aware, we have some very tight timelines that we've been asked to, to review this legislation by. So, I would submit or request that, a deadline, a reasonable deadline, Friday at noon to provide this documentation. If you could meet that requirement, that would certainly help us dispense with our duties.
I would just like to add, in response to the executive compensation repayment requirements, as that compares 2021 compensation with 2029 compensation, that information would be unavailable as the 2021 year hasn't ended yet. But we will certainly reach out to CRA for the other information.
Okay, thank you. And so just so we're clear, a list of all CEWS recipients and the period for which they applied in the simple form in Excel would be very helpful. And then back on the documentation of the pre-verification and post-verification checks, both on the applicant side and the government side. And then please confirm for this committee how many post-verification checks have been completed, both for CERB and for CEWS, and how many have been rejected. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chambers. We're moving now to the Liberals for 6 minutes. Mr. Baker, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of questions for our witnesses, but I I couldn't help but overhear the sort of the exchange between Mr. Chambers and the officials, and Mr. Chambers and his colleagues are very concerned about making sure, appear to be very concerned about making sure that those who receive the wage subsidy of the CERB are entitled to receive it. And it was interesting because I was reminded of a motion in the House from the Parliament, and and this was introduced by a Conservative, that given that the pandemic has had devastating consequences on Canadian workers and businesses, especially in the restaurant, hospitalities, and tourism sectors, the House call on this government to immediately pause the audits of small businesses that received the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy until at least June 2021. So on the one hand, the Conservatives are saying they're very concerned about people receiving the wage subsidy when they shouldn't have, and on the other hand, they voted against measures to make sure that what they're concerned about wasn't happening. So I wanted to point that out. The entire Conservative caucus voted in favor of that motion. The entire government caucus voted against. I just wanted to point that out for the record. I'd like to talk about the impact of these programs, and I'm wondering if our team from finance could speak to how many people have been impacted by the programs that have been put in place to support people through this pandemic and businesses through the pandemic. So how many people have benefited from the CERB, and how many businesses have benefited through the wage subsidy?
So on the wage and rent subsidy front, I can answer that part of the question. So based on the latest available data, there's been about 450,000 businesses, employers that have claimed the wage subsidy. The number of employees supported for each month varies from month to month, but it was up to 5.3 million at the height of the pandemic. And so far, there's been 98 billion that has been disbursed under this program. For the rent subsidy, the number of applicants is above 200,000 so far, unique applicants, and the amount paid out from this program is 7.3 billion.
And under the CERB, do you have the figures for the CERB?
Sorry, you're muted.
Oh, I'll try again. So my understanding was...
No, it was the comment was for Mr. Mers.
Oh, I see.
I will repeat.
Could have sworn I wasn't muted.
So for the Canada Recovery Benefit, there have been about approximately 2.3 million unique applicants, so Canadians who have benefited throughout the duration of the benefit. For the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit, there have been about 780,000 unique applicants that have benefited. And for the Canada Recovery Caregiving Benefit, there's been about almost 500,000 workers who have benefited across Canada for the duration of the benefit.
Okay. So I just wanted to recap those numbers and make sure I got them correctly. So through the wage subsidy, 5.3 million people have benefited. Through the rent subsidy, 200,000 businesses have benefited. And who knows how many people that has touched and allowed, how many businesses that has allowed to stay afloat, and how many individual Canadians that's allowed those businesses to employ. The CRB has touched 2.3 million people. The Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit has impacted 780,000 people, and the caregiving benefit has impacted 500,000 people. Like, that's an incredible number of people who were desperate for help and who got help from the government at a critical time. So I want to thank you and your team and those officials who've been working on that for your hard work in making these programs possible. And I think that that's something that we should all of us on both sides of the House, on both sides of this committee, should be celebrating. Chair, how much time do I have left?
You've got a minute and 15 seconds.
Minute 15 seconds.
Yep.
Okay. J'ai une question encore pour...
I have a question for our colleagues in finance. Throughout the pandemic, these programs have been modified and pivoted to respond to an ever-changing situation. Can you explain to us how departments reacted to these multiple changes?
Alors, peut-être que je peux
I think I can start to talk about the transition towards the CRB. We saw an improvement of the economy, the labor market, employment rates reached almost pre-pandemic levels. Unemployment rates have reached those levels. Labor shortages have increased, and so labor market indicators improved as we saw this fall. But there were risks, there were uncertainties, and those are still very present with the evolution of the virus. These subsidies adapted to this ever-changing situation.
We're now moving to the block, and welcome Madame Saint-Clair Desgagnés.
Dégagné.
The
Merci.
floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
2 minutes and a half. 6 minutes? Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. That's great. My first question is about seasonal workers. How does this legislation apply to them? There are 2 criteria. 1, there has to be a decreased average wage over 12 months, which are defined as March 2020 to March 2021. The second criteria is that you have to have a loss of 50% of revenues on the current month year over year. But for seasonal workers who do not have an income in the low season, how do you compare 50% of zero to 100% of zero? That's really difficult. And I'd like to know what C2 is planning for these workers and how they can be compensated. Thank you for the question. I can add something about these specific workers. Many of them were able to take advantage of temporary programs for EI if they were affected by the pandemic and experienced job loss or a reduction in working hours. They either were able to get EI or other subsidies. So the subsidies we're talking about today would allow us to take into consideration revenues that were received while still giving them access to subsidies. So these revenue sources are eligible. I hope this helps answer the question. As a follow-up, let's talk about eligible wage types. If they have no revenue planned for an off season, what numbers are we using? We use the 12 prior months or the year 2020. If they worked or received subsidies in this time, if the amount is up to a minimum of $5,000, then they're admissible. And what about the other criteria that requires a month-per-month comparison? I don't think that this applies to the specific subsidy we're talking about. Maybe that's for businesses, but for workers, it's not on a month-to-month basis. Yes, I'm talking about businesses that have been so hardly touched. So for seasonal businesses that do not have revenues in the off-season, how can they satisfy the second criteria? I think I can answer. I think it's useful to understand what's happening with employment subsidies, supports. For the businesses that are the most touches, it's the revenue of month over month. This is one criteria that was imported from the previous wage subsidy and rent subsidy programs. This was established at the start of the pandemic. It's been there really since the start. Employers understand this criteria. But indeed, in practice, what this means is that businesses have to be able to demonstrate that they've lost revenue in the current month. This is the criteria that was selected by the government to qualify businesses that have been affected most. Inaudible for the interpreter. So if I can summarize, we're on the same wavelength for businesses, but what about seasonal employees who used to be able to get CERB without going through their business? But for seasonal workers, if I understand Madame Demerce's answer, they'll be covered by C2 if they earn more than $5,000 over the course of the 12-month period. Yes, that's correct, or in 2020. Thank you, that's clear. Next question. Someone who's asking for a caregiving benefit or sick benefit, this legislation hasn't been adopted. Would they be able to get retroactive support for the period in which they're eligible? This is what we've planned for in the bill. So once it comes into effect with its changes, the benefits can be retroactive to November 20th. So benefits were extended until November, and now with this bill, what we would like to do is extend them further from November 20th. So it would be possible for workers to make a request within 60 days if they were affected in one of those weeks. Thank you. How much time do I have left? So I would like to take the rest of my time to thank the officials for their answers. Thank you.
To the NDP and Mr. Blakey for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. One of the things that this legislation does is extend the leave period for workers under the Canada Labour Code so that they can be entitled to take leave consistent with the program length of the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit and the Canada Recovery Caregiving Benefit, both of which are being increased by 2 weeks. But of course, this will only be in federally regulated workplaces, which is about, I think, 17% of the Canadian workforce. What efforts have already been made to reach out to provinces, and does the government have any commitments from the provinces that they will likewise be extending leave provisions at the provincial level so that Canadians can benefit from the extension of these programs?
Thank you, Mr. Blakey. I can respond to that question if you'd like. My name is Douglas Wolf. I'm from the Labour Program. And you're quite right that the provisions do only apply to federally regulated workers. So that's a small fraction of the overall labor force. So certainly provinces and territories are aware of these provisions, and they're certainly aware that Bill C2 is making its way through Parliament, and we fully expect that they will make the amendments that would be required so that employees within the provincial and territorial jurisdictions can also have job-protected leaves.
Is that expectation based on any communication that you've had with the provinces? Are there any provinces that have introduced legislation so that this can be done in a timely way?
To my knowledge, no province has introduced legislation yet, but certainly normally with something, a bill like this one, provinces would follow suit. Of course, they are fully autonomous, but normally they would follow suit for a bill such as this one.
Has anyone in the federal government surveyed the legislative calendars of provinces to get an idea of when they might be able to introduce and pass legislation? I'm thinking that, provided that this legislation passes in time for Christmas here, if no other provinces have actually undertaken to make complementary legislative reforms, this leave actually won't be available to 87% of the Canadian workforce, or thereabouts, 83 maybe, until sometime in late January, February, or March. Does the federal government have any expectation as to when respecting, of course, that they are independent, but has there been enough communication to have a reasonable expectation about when provincial leave requirements might be expanded?
So yes, it's a great question, and it's certainly important. I should say that for most provinces, they already have they do have provisions in place already due to what has come before. And so for some of them, that may mean simply extending these provisions. But for the vast majority of them, they already do have provisions in place, just to be clear.
Okay, so for the vast majority of provinces, you're saying the leave provisions required are already in place, and Canadians could avail themselves in most provinces as soon as this legislation passes here in Ottawa. Could you provide a list for the committee of which provinces would already be compliant in their leave provisions with this legislation and which ones aren't, and what communications have happened with the ones that aren't?
We'd be happy to.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask for the Canadian worker lockdown benefit. Of course, we've talked a little bit about the retroactivity of the benefit. Canadians will have 60 days to apply after the coming into force of Bill C-2. But my understanding so far, and I'm looking for confirmation from the department, is that there is no region in Canada that has met the requirements that would trigger the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit between the period starting October 23rd and now. Is that true?
So whether a region is a lockdown region for the purposes of the benefit will be a determination of the Governor and Council on the recommendation of the Minister of ESDC.
Yeah.
Once the legislation is passed. So in the meantime, the department is monitoring situations across Canada.
We're talking about the past. So for any of the period that has already happened up to today, are there any regions where the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit criteria would be met?
This would need to be a decision, a recommendation by the minister and a decision of the Governor and Council.
Have there been any public health lockdowns as defined in the Act since October 23rd to date?
That will need to be determined. This is something that we are tracking, and this will need to be determined.
Let me rephrase the question. Is there any region in Canada where the department, based on the information available, would recommend to the Governor and Council that they deem the criteria of the legislation to have been met?
This assessment is ongoing. So there are restrictions, public health restrictions. Are being assessed, are being tracked. And this assessment, this tracking is ongoing.
It is concerning to me that the government wouldn't have an idea already for the period from October 23rd to now of whether the criteria it's laid out in its own legislation to trigger a benefit for $300 a week for workers who are in distress would have been met or not. I mean, we know what the public health orders for the jurisdictions have been since October 23rd. There's no new information coming to be analyzed. So how is it that the department could have no idea? And how would you even assess the cost of this program for October 23rd to now if you have no idea whether the public health orders to date would be sufficient to trigger the legislation or not?
Thank you, Mr. Blakey. That's your time. We are moving to our second round of questions, and this will go to the Conservatives and Mr. Polyev for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. My questions relate to the sickness and caregiving benefits. Can the officials tell us what is the duration of the sickness benefit and what is the duration of the caregiving benefit?
So thank you for the question. The duration currently for the sickness benefit is a maximum of 4 weeks. and it is proposed that it be extended by an additional 2 weeks to 6 weeks total. And for the caregiving benefit, currently the maximum duration is 42 weeks, and the proposal is to extend it to 44 weeks.
So on sickness, under the bill's proposal, it would go to 6 weeks? Do I have that right?
That's correct, an additional
Right.
2 weeks.
Okay. And it would be $500 a week. Do I have that right?
The same parameters would apply, that is correct.
Okay. What does someone have to do to prove that they are sick and qualify for the sickness benefit?
The same eligibility requirement will apply. It is attestation based. If you agree, I would like to ask my colleague Benoit
Sure.
to provide the details on those requirements.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for the question. So, like Catherine mentioned, it is attestation based. A claimant would have to see a reduction in the hours that they could work for a specific week by at least 50% in order to be eligible. So if they meet that requirement, in addition to having a valid SIN, having the right age and everything, they would be eligible for the benefit.
But how would they prove that that reduction is the result of being sick?
So it is entirely attestation based.
So they just attest to being sick.
Correct.
Is there any verification?
Like we mentioned in previous questions, the Canada Revenue Agency does do post verification audits based on.
How many of those have been done?
We will come back with those numbers as requested earlier.
All right. And when you say verification audits, how do they verify whether someone was sick after the fact?
They can ask. They have the authority to ask for proof of, like for example, a medical certificate, for example, that claimants can provide.
But are claimants required to get a note from a doctor before they apply for the benefit?
They do not.
Okay, well then, if Revenue Canada were to ask for one after the fact, then the claimant would obviously say, well, I didn't get one because it's not required.
There are other things that the claimant could have, such as a proof that they took a test, that they were tested for COVID-19.
But what if they don't have any of that? What would happen then?
I would have to defer to colleagues from the CRA
is there any proof that someone has to provide to show that they were in fact sick in order to get the $500 a week or roughly $2,000 a month?
There is no proof that somebody would have to show that they were indeed sick. However, like I mentioned, the CRA does have the authority to ask for information to determine eligibility for the benefit.
But no information is required. So they do not have, in order to be eligible, they do not have to have a doctor's note. They do not have to have a test showing any particular illness. They can simply attest that they are sick and they receive $2,000 a month.
At the time of application, that's correct.
Right.
But the CRA can verify and ask for additional documents afterwards.
No, I understand that. But even if they did ask for those documents afterwards, the claimant could simply say those are not required. And therefore, I did not seek them. Correct?
That could happen. Correct.
Right. Okay.
Mr. Poilievre, we are moving now to the Liberals, and we have Madame Chatel for 5 minutes.
Yeah, that question of my colleague remind me of what do we have to prove to our whip if we are sick and cannot attend the chamber, but that's another question. I'm concerned about the impact of not passing this bill in time for Christmas break. I have question for part 2, but let's start with part 1. I wonder what are the impact of not adopting the measures on the specific industry that we are intended to help. So, and I also have noticed that in the bill there are other regulation, existing legislation that are being amended by this bill. And so if I can have also the technical impact on the coordination measures on those provisions in the bill. So if the bill doesn't pass before Christmas, what happened with the other regulation that we intended to amend?
Thank you for the question. I can certainly start off with the answer in respect of part one. The simple answer is that the Canada Revenue Agency requires royal assent of Bill C2 before it can make payments under the wage subsidy or any of the programs in part one after the end of November, which was the legislated expiration time. There are some housekeeping measures relating to regulations in the bill, in particular for the 20th and I think 21st qualifying periods, where parameters for those extended periods that had been done through regulation are being moved into the Act. It may not always seem to be the case, but we do try to make the rules as user-friendly as possible. And so moving those parameters from the regulations to the Act puts everything in one place, but does not result in a substantive change. For the 23rd qualifying period that ends November, I think it's November 22nd, that could either be made through the normal regulatory process, or it could be made through this bill. If regulations are in fact promulgated before this bill receives royal assent, then the bill would have the effect of repealing those regulations and moving them into the Act along with the parameters for the 21st qualifying period to tidy them up. But for the periods ending after November, which are currently precluded under the existing law, the Canada Revenue Agency would be unable to make payments before royal assent of this bill.
Thank you. That really answer one of the concern I have, that people will not receive help before Christmas time. So thank you for that answer. J'ai une question aussi par.
Now I have another question for regarding part two. I wonder if we do not measure the impact of not adopting this bill before Christmas, who would be most impacted? What groups would be most impacted? Ms. Demers, please. Thank you for the question. We see through the use of benefits for the caregiving benefit, the sickness benefits, etc., that the use of those benefits has changed depending on the cycles of the pandemic. When we saw greater restrictions, there have been more benefits paid out. So when there are more restrictions, people use the benefits. When there are less restrictions, there is less demand. Now, when it comes to the profile of those people, we know that for caregivers, most of them are women. Over 60% of them are women. People caring for their children because there are schools closing, or people caring for their parents because institutions are closed because of COVID. And for those reasons, these people cannot go back to work. As well, there are some workers who earn less, or independent workers. Those people do not have the protection of a regular job that would allow them to take leave. So for that reason, because of the uncertainty of the pandemic, people are not obliged to go back to work, and other people at risk. Thank you.
Now we'll move to the block and Madame Sinclair Desganay.
Question sur les subventions aux entreprises. À votre connaissance, y a-t-il d'autres secteurs qui souffrent de la crise autant que le tourisme et l'accueil dont je salue l'inclusion?
Oui, je peux peut-être répondre à cette question. Merci pour la question. Effectivement, donc il y a une certaine volonté d'aider en particulier le secteur du tourisme, puis il y a ces programmes-là de subvention.
Point of order. Point of order.
The interpreter was on the wrong channel. I apologize.
Okay. Yep. We have stop time, so you'll still have you've got 2 minutes left.
Je dois refaire la question?
Do I have to repeat the question? My question is quite simple. To your knowledge, are there other sectors that have suffered as much as the tourism sector? Answer. As I was saying, and as you have mentioned, there has been a special focus in these programs for the tourism sector that has been particularly impacted because of restrictions and travel restrictions. But when we look at both programs, the one for the tourism sector and the most impacted businesses program, we cover most of the economic spectrum. This is why these programs are agnostic to specific sectors and are available to all businesses who are facing difficulties in these sectors. Second question, if there are other businesses that are having financial hardship as much as people from the tourism sector because of supply chains that have been stopped because of the pandemic, there are other sectors who are in financial hardship, and they are classified in the ones that have been most impacted. So could we include them, or could we give them the same treatment as industries in the tourism sector?
Yeah, when it comes to that, I have to say that, that lockdown program is helpful if there are new lockdowns, if supply chains are interrupted again. Every business that is hit by those lockdowns could potentially qualify for a program, which would actually just come and copy that tourism sector program. Okay, but without talking about lockdowns, we're talking about long-term impacts on certain businesses where, supply chains were hit very hard.
Thank you. We've heard in a few places that the anticipated budget for these measures is just over $7 billion. Is that fair to say? Just looking for a yes. All right, I got a yes. Great. What proportion of that is for the Canada Worker lockdown benefit? I'm sure somebody's doing a drum roll, but they're on mute. Yeah.
Not sure if my colleagues could provide an answer to that. What we can say is that the estimated use and volume is difficult to estimate because it depends on whether there will be the occurrence of regional lockdowns.
But there is a budget, like some of that $7 billion is an allocation for the Canada Worker lockdown benefit. Is that not true?
And yes, for the ensemble of the measures. So I think this is something that perhaps, not sure if I would turn to my colleagues at finance, but there would certainly for the lockdown benefit, we know that the estimated volume is a number that is difficult to predict. That said,
but there is an estimate. So I guess I'm just
there
curious
would
to
be
know
an
what
estimate.
what's the estimate? I get that it's difficult to come up with an estimate, but somebody did because there's a budget number. So what is the estimate and how did you arrive at it?
So perhaps if I'm not seeing anyone from finance, we can dig this question back if that's okay with you.
I guess so. I have to say this is the kind of question that I really would have thought when we get a briefing from officials would not be a difficult one, particularly when the government has been very upfront about a budgetary forecast for the bill. There are two main components. There are the measures that fall roughly under the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy programming, and then the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit. I'd have thought that we were not getting into difficult questions just to ask what amount is allocated for the Worker Lockdown Benefit.
And now we'll move to the Conservatives. Mr. Stewart for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple points of interest. I do think it's not benefiting any of the members of the committee that there aren't officials here from CRA that could answer some of the questions that finance obviously can't answer with relation to policy. I think it would be beneficial to have CRA officials appear as witnesses tomorrow. I think that would be helpful. I just want to make that statement for now. First question, can any of the witnesses tell me how much it is going to cost to administer the full suite of programs? We know that it's around $7.4 billion worth, or at least that was the initial forecast, but how much is it going to cost to administer the programs?
Just on part one of the bill, we don't have those estimates in hand, but we can certainly get back to the committee on that part one part in terms of the administration cost or part of the total figure, what that estimate is.
Okay, so we know that there's $7.4 billion worth of funding that's going to be doled out to people who are deserving or potentially not at all. My question is very simple. If you can have a budgetary item and if the government can be prepared to fast-track $7.4 billion of spending without actually telling anyone where the money's coming from, I think it's very important for all the members in the committee here today to know exactly what this is going to cost to dole out $7.4 billion. So I'm asking again, what was the cost, what will be the cost to administer all of this suite of funding?
As I indicate, Mr. Chair, we can return with taking out the cost breakdown. We just don't happen to have those numbers at this stage.
Mr. Chair, with all due respect, at this stage, we are in day 2 of proceedings that are not going to last for very long.
I meant with. I apologize.
So will we be able to determine what this will administer tomorrow? Will the answer to this question be here tomorrow? Through the chair, of course.
Right.
Is that a yes?
Mr. Chair, we can endeavor to provide those answers along with the other CRA-related questions that were asked earlier, if that's all right.
I've got another question that's related to the same line of questioning, but let's say today that people came prepared and they actually, through the chair, of course, they actually provided details that they would certainly have. My question is the number that we now have to wait potentially another day, maybe forever, but is that number coupled within the $7.4 billion worth of spending, or is that an increase, an extra expenditure?
My colleague, Mr. Poirier, can verify, but my understanding is that that's included.
Final question then for now. How many staff have been hired to carry out the doling out of $7.4 billion?
Well, again, that's a question for on the administrative side of things. A question for the Canada Revenue Agency.
Through the chair,
Can't speak to that.
CRA needs to be here tomorrow. It's yet another question that went unanswered, is actually what it is. Thank you.
Mr. Stewart, we'll move now to the Liberals. And Mr. McDonald, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I wanted to ask, relevant to supply chain disruptions, which we heard earlier, and persistent supply constraints, and now we're into a variant with limited international travel. How important or what effect do they have on our economic level at this point, and how important would this bill suffice to improve that?
Maybe I can try an answer that perhaps would not directly respond. That said, the benefits that are proposed here are exactly to help contain the spread of the virus. So helping individuals who are at risk to stay at home, and if whether the region is in a lockdown, there are higher risks related to the restrictions, or in their communities. It is really meant for that, to support individuals and helping them make the decision to stay at home and not go back to work.
Maybe can you explain how the general economic situation has improved because of the programs that were put in place and potentially the program that we're dealing with right now, C2?
So what we are seeing is with the transition of the two, so the transition with this more targeted suite of supports for workers impacted by the pandemic, is recognition of two things. One, the movement into a next phase of the recovery, where we're seeing employment levels back to pre-pandemic levels, where we're seeing increase in job vacancy rates, where we're seeing a return to a return of the economy across sectors that is really leading to, therefore, the provision of additional supports that are really much more targeted in a context of providing the supports that are needed in the context of public health restrictions, really leading to a public health related support versus addressing kind of broad-based, generalized economic impacts of the pandemic.
Change it up a little bit, but if back to the CRA questions, if someone can't provide a document during a CRA audit, it's likely they would be rejected or asked to repay it. Is this correct?
Pardon, so I'm sorry, I did not hear the question very well. If they are deemed to be ineligible, that would be they would be in a situation where they would need to repay. That's correct.
Thank you. That's fine. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so we will move to our third round. Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. And we've got the Conservatives for 5 minutes. Mr. McLean.
Well, thank you. And we've heard a lot here today, and following on my colleague Mr. Blakey's comments about the lack of definition for clarity about what we actually are going to be dealing with going forward here, that clarity is required for the definition of the money we're going to be spending here. Surely there's a financial model that's predicated on some real definitions of how this money will be spent under what circumstances. And if we don't even know what those circumstances are in retrospect, if they apply, then clearly this modeling is somewhat suspect. Now, I'm going to make some excuses for the finance officials here because I know you arrived late. We're briefed on this late to actually appear here today, and that's a result of this bill being jammed too late into a process that's going to take a bunch of time here right at the end of the year. However, there was a time when the Department of Finance, in drafting a bill like this, starting in the mid-1990s, was rather good at making sure that this modeling was clear. This modeling is no longer clear, and I don't know if it's because things have been lax during COVID, but this is something you need to get right for the country. So I do have some questions around the financial modeling and the expectations, because here we've heard that $7 billion might be the amount we spend, depending on the definitions, through to May. But then it might go through till July. And this is just a blank checkbook. And I know the government has had a blank checkbook for far too long. This has to change. And this has to change in the Department of Finance in particular, because they're advising the minister. I know there's a lot of moving parts. Let me ask a question about the debt to GDP ratio, because with the amount of spending this government has taken on, they've ramped up the debt to GDP ratio to 54%. They're going to manage it down to 51% over the next handful of decades and keep it there. Have you factored these numbers in to that debt to GDP ratio? I know there's a lot of moving parts. Is this even a consideration? Silence.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I can maybe just add that the economic and fiscal forecast again is sort of outside of the scope of what is in the bill, and it is something that is done by officials and other, like I say, on the economic and fiscal forecasting side. On the tax policy side, especially we're essentially here to answer questions on what's in the bill, and so that I'm not sure I'm the right person to address.
Okay,
that,
let me ask some more questions here. Respecting tourism, which you're not sure about the definitions on tourism recovery, you're proposing that the amount of subsidization go down by half in March to May in the current bill. What percentage of Canada's tourism industry ramps up in the spring? Boy, it takes a long time to get an answer.
Well, again, the horizon for these programs and the way that they sort of phase out is based on the economic projection, and the health outlook, and that's the notion on which those are based. So.
Okay. Outlook. Appreciate that. These entities are going to have to pay back $40,000 of $60,000 that they've been loaned by the government at the end of the year. Any idea how that's going to happen in the cash flow you might have forecast for the industry going forward?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. Something. That there was
a lot of these entities were accorded $60,000 of relief to get through the first stages of COVID by this government, of which they have to pay back $40,000 by the end of this year. Do you have any modeling about how that's going to affect their viability this coming year when they may not have any money to pay back?
I believe that's referring to another program. If I'm not sure what program the honourable member is referring to, but is it the loan program? If so, again, that's not my area.
That's the time we have, Mr. McLean. Yep, we'll move over to the Liberals, Ms. Zarowitz, for 5 minutes.
Already me. Okay, thank you so much. I just, Mr. Chair, if I could just request. Mr. Blakey had asked, he didn't exactly ask this specifically, but I do think it's important for us to have a breakdown of the $7.4 billion in terms of the different programs that we have. Could I please request through you to our officials to get that in writing from our officials as soon as possible, ideally tomorrow? I think we should have that information that should be readily available to all of us.
Thank you. I accept that, Ms. Zarowitz. I did understand that the officials were going to do that homework and look to, I believe, the CRA to be able to get some of those numbers. But yes, we'll request that.
Yeah, I don't think it's something the CRA would have. I think our officials would have that in finance, but I think that for some reason we don't have that available today. Anyways, thank you so much for the opportunity to ask a few more questions. I wanted to ask. I think on category 1, which is around the supports for businesses, the tourism and hospitality recovery program, and the hardest hit business. Actually, it's more around the hardest hit business recovery program. If we actually read through sort of the backgrounder, there's a very specific list of who's actually included. And I wouldn't mind hearing from officials around how is it that they came up with the list. Was it through recommendations that finance might have made through some of the meetings that we had earlier this year? Was it through an understanding or consultations with the different industry groups that we've actually come up with this comprehensive list? I wouldn't mind just getting an understanding about how we actually came up with the list that we have. I think it's a good list, by the way, but I wouldn't mind understanding how we sort of compiled and settled on it.
I can take that question, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I believe you're referring. You said hardest hit, but I believe you're referring to the tourism and hospitality recovery program. It's the one that has the list, and that program is intended to support the tourism and hospitality organizations that have been deeply affected by the pandemic and continue to struggle. And it's also those that are generally affected by public health restrictions. So it's very much through those two lenses that the definition was developed. And as you suggested, there were indeed engagement with stakeholders to try and understand where those needs were, and their input was solicited, and how to best define those types of businesses to arrive at that definition. And as we've noted earlier, maybe there are some businesses that have been hard hit that don't fall within the parameters of that definition, and that's why the hard hit businesses program is there for those that have still been hard hit, but do fall outside the scope of the Tourism and Hospitality Recovery Program.
Mhm.
I hope that answers the question.
It does, Mr. Baylor, so I appreciate that. And I stand corrected. You're absolutely right. It is the, I'm just looking at the backgrounder now, the eligibility for the Tourism and Hospitality Recovery Program. Can I also ask, and I'm glad that we did extensive consultation, did we also discuss with them the level of support that we were contemplating providing them? The reason for my question is just getting an understanding of making sure that we sort of tested with them what they felt was the support that they needed in order to continue to survive and thrive as we try to come out of COVID.
Yeah.
And this is to you again.
Yes. My understanding is that was part of the discussion. Perhaps my colleague again, Yves Poirier, as I mentioned earlier, was more involved with the consultation. So he can perhaps add to that.
Oh, is that it? Okay.
No, he's...
No, yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
No, as Max was saying, I mean, it was partly through engagement with stakeholders, including other departments that might be managing other tourism-related programs that, I mean, we came up partly with the definition, and then in terms of level, I mean, we also received input and we took that into consideration when developing like the sliding scale for the subsidy rate and what kind of threshold would need to be met to qualify for the measure, recognizing that the intention was to move away from the broad-based support programs we had before to a more targeted approach that would provide more support, but to a specific subset of industries.
Thank you, Ms. Zarowitz. Over to the bloc and Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Every time you pronounce my name, you're getting better and better. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Encouragement.
So following up to my earlier questions with regards to businesses that have been hard hit by the pandemic, I'm surprised to hear from our public servants that the two criteria that are mentioned are very clear, because what we're hearing is that the two criteria are very restrictive. My question is this: for businesses that are hard hit but that don't meet the 50% criteria of lost revenue over 12 months, is there any flexibility on either one of the criteria? Can there be flexibility with a 12-month period? Maybe it could be moved over to demonstrate a loss of revenue over another period during the pandemic, or the second criteria, which I mentioned, that is very restrictive because, as we know, businesses have revenue fluctuations. For example, when their materials arrive, if there's delivery delays. So could there be flexibility on one of the two criteria if necessary?
I can speak briefly to the criteria from the legislative side and then let my colleagues join in on the policy side. So for the month-over-month revenue decline calculation, that has some flexibility in that you can elect to have either the current month tested against the same month in the prior year, or in the January and February period before the pandemic. There's also a deeming rule that lets you have the better or the larger revenue decline for the current period or the prior period that provides some flexibility in smoothing out revenue, different revenue months, and provides certainty. There's also elections that allow, for example, the cash basis of accounting to be used, or the normal accrual basis if you're ordinarily a cash basis taxpayer, as well as different rules that let you determine revenues if you're part of a group. And so there is some flexibility, although it is fundamentally a month-over-month or a period-over-period test. One bit of flexibility in terms of the 12-month test. It's not a big thing to highlight, but probably maybe worth mentioning, is you look at the revenues for the first 13 periods. And in order to avoid double counting December over December, then there's the flexibility to exclude one of those 2 months as well. Although that's a much smaller thing than the flexibilities I'd mentioned prior.
Thank you, Mr.
I don't
McGowan.
know if Max
yeah,
or
we're
Ian?
going actually to move. Thank you, Mr. McGowan. We'll be moving to the NDP. Mr. Blakey for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I'm a supporter of the notion of public service. I believe that there's a positive role for the government to play in the economic life of the country. These are all things that I believe in and that I defend. I have to say I've been very disheartened by today's interaction with some of our lead civil servants on a really important file. Presumably, this is the table of advisors that the ministers have around them when they're planning important programs. I've asked for a breakdown of the budget. I don't know if they really don't have that answer or if they're on a mission of obfuscation. If that's true, it certainly doesn't manifest the kind of respect that there ought to be for the legislative branch of government. If they don't have the answer, then what are we to draw from that? I mean, does this mean that the minister sitting around the table with her advisors didn't bother to ask this question, so nobody's created the answer? When we ask about the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit and if it would apply in any region of the country between October 23rd and now, and they don't have the answer, does that mean the minister didn't ask? Does that mean that Minister Qualtrough didn't ask this table, hey guys, we're putting together a piece of legislation, it's retroactive. They've emphasized the importance of the retroactivity of the legislation. Did the minister never ask where in the country it would apply retroactively? Either you have to conclude that our civil servants who ought to be treating the legislature with respect aren't being upfront about some of these questions, or you have to conclude that the people that are running the country never bothered to ask them. Neither one is a very good outcome for Canadians. And I have to say, I know that we've been in a rush because the Prime Minister took his sweet time bringing Parliament back, but the departments have been developing this legislation for a while. The ministers have had ample opportunity to ask the questions that have been posed here today. I don't think I've been asking particularly political questions. They're just questions of fact about the bill, how it works, why certain decisions were made to leave certain things out, what the budget breakdown is. And we can't get a straight answer. We've been here almost 4 hours. And I haven't gotten one thing that I would classify as an answer to a question that I've asked, Mr. Chair. I'm really quite beside myself with displeasure at the way that this has unfolded. And I certainly hope that we're going to get some answers in the rest of our testimony, or this really doesn't do much for anyone. So I'm hoping that people are going to get their act together and we're actually going to be able to get some answers to questions, because so far this has been a waste of time.
Thank you, Mr. Blakey. We are moving to the Conservatives. Mr. Chambers for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have heard a number of the members bring up timing and the need for speed. A few questions on timing, if I may. We knew the CRB programs and some of these programs were expiring in the fall. At what point in time or what time of year, what month did we start designing, or did the government start designing these new packages?
Maybe I can start, Mr. Chair. This is work that, as the department, as if we can recall, there was the possibility under the CRB to extend the benefits should they be needed until October, and November 20th was the end date under the legislation. Tracking was undertaken by the department throughout the delivery of the Canada Recovery Benefit to examine labor market indicators and the evolution and patterns of applications of each benefit in function of the state of the labor market and the economy and the pandemic. So that has been kind of an ongoing work to do this tracking. knowing that the benefits were ending by October, and which led the government to examine the needs given the state of the labor market and the pandemic for future targeted support.
Okay, thank you. Ed, would it be safe to say that the design of these programs occurred in the summer, June, July? We were thinking about these. The government was thinking about these in June and July.
The work has, as I was saying, has been linked to the Canada Recovery Benefit, the existing Canada Recovery Benefit. So whether there were signs that required, as provided in the legislation, the extension of those benefits until November 20th.
Thank you.
So those are yes, those are the benefits I'm referring to.
Missy, when did the government start drafting C2 legislation? Approximate date, on or about? A week or a month would be fine. Last week, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago,
so
2 months ago?
The announcement was made. I don't know if my colleagues from finance would like to respond. The announcement was made on October 21st for these additional measures.
Thank you. So if it's weird to understand that drafting this really important bill had to wait until an announcement was made on October 21st, at which point the government started drafting the legislation, so post-announcement. Correct?
I would have to defer to colleagues at the Department of Finance.
I mean, I can speak to part one of the bill only, as I was involved in the drafting of that. It has been an iterative process, certainly from tabling the first bill, hearing stakeholder responses, and then iteratively improving on the programs over the last almost 2 years. And in terms of the work on Bill C2, that was going on kind of in concert with the announcements. It's not been days or weeks, I'm sure.
So I suppose. Okay, thank you. I suppose what we're really getting at is we're being asked to fast track a bill's passage. There was some ongoing work being done over the last 2 years. A bill like C2, requires a significant amount of time, but legislators and department officials had to deal with an election, which seems to appear to have delayed the drafting of this bill or the conclusion of the drafting of this bill. And yet we then wait a significant amount of time to come back to Parliament to introduce the new legislation. And then we are asked, because of a need for speed or haste, to fast track a bill's passage. But I think what we're hearing is, at least I hear.
Thank you, Mr. Chambers.
It was difficult to get this done on time.
Thank you. We are moving to Liberals and Mr. Baker for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair, and I have a few questions for our witnesses, but before I ask them, I just wanted to address something that was said in the prior interventions, particularly by Mr. Blakey, where he, I disagree with the conclusion that Mr. Blakey drew that because some questions weren't answered today, that the minister didn't ask them, or that the people advising the minister aren't capable or qualified to provide excellent advice in the crafting of this legislation. I think I don't know what questions the minister asked, and I don't know who was at the table in each of those meetings, of course. But I think it's also important for us to consider that it's possible, in fact, I think it's likely, that a lot of these questions and many others that we haven't thought of were asked, and that answers were obtained, but either A, they weren't obtained by the officials who are here on this Zoom with us today, in this committee today, so these particular folks don't happen to have that information or don't recall it, or that the information was obtained in part by the folks who are in this committee, the witnesses who are at this committee, the officials, but that they don't have that information at their fingertips today. And I can think of several instances where the officials who are on this call trying to answer the questions have said, look, I don't have that at my fingertips, but they've committed to get back to us with that information. So I just wanted to make sure we didn't jump to conclusions. It's important we get answers, that this committee get the answers to the important questions that need to be asked in reviewing legislation, but I think it's important that we not jump to the conclusion that the folks advising the minister aren't capable or the minister's not asking the right questions. Je voulais demander une question sur les...
I want to ask a question regarding the targeted sectors in this bill. This bill targets tourism, the tourism sector. I wanted to ask, and this question is for our senior officials from the Department of Finance, why are we targeting the tourism sector?
Yes. As I indicated, the tourism and hospitality recovery program is intended to support the tourism and hospitality organizations that have been deeply affected and continue to struggle through the pandemic. And it's an area in particular that continues to be affected by the public health restrictions that we're seeing. So it's that sector in particular that is bearing that. And again, engaging with stakeholders and what was heard, that these were the sectors that still needed support, and that's why the government has been moving to this more targeted approach as the pandemic evolves, as the economy starts to recover, as the health restrictions start to be dialed back. But you still have sectors that need help. And as I say, the tourism and hospitality sector in particular is sort of falls through. If you look at through those two lenses, it sort of falls in that area. And again, not to say that there aren't other organizations outside of that sector that continue to struggle because of the pandemic as well, and that's why the hard-hit businesses recovery program has also been put in place to provide a sort of more blanket, neutral program that's also available.
Ouais, oui, je comprends. C'est vraiment.
I understand. This bill doesn't give an extensive list. This is targeted help for the people who need it the most. People in the tourism sector, businesses who have been hit with the greatest loss of revenue, and people who are affected by public health restrictions that do not allow them to work and to support their families. Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I think I only have 15 seconds.
Okay. Merci, Monsieur Baker. Thank you. We are moving to the Conservatives. Is it Mr. McLean or Mr. Polyev?
Thank you. So back on the sickness benefit, if in a post-verification, an official goes to a claimant and asks for a doctor's note, and the claimant says, I didn't get one, will the claimant have to return the money that they got from the sickness benefit?
Thank you for the question. I will see if my colleague Benoit Cadieux has the answer, or else we will certainly make sure that we obtain this answer from the CRA.
A claimant that would be unable to provide the requested documentation could be found to be disentitled from the benefits that they received.
Could be. So if they don't provide the documentation, CRA calls up and says, you could be disentitled. And then the claimant says, okay, am I? And they say, well,
So
you could be.
The Act does provide for the authority for the CRA to disentitle claimants when they don't provide the requested documentation or they don't provide the requested information.
And is there a list of documentation that is required to prove that someone is sick?
There is no list, so the CRA does have the flexibility to request any type of documentation that they feel would.
So if the claimant says, look, no one told me I had to get a doctor's note, and now I'm no longer sick, I was sick when I got the benefit, then what will CRA then do?
So like I said, CRA does have the authority to ask for any type of document. It could be the proof that they were tested for COVID-19. It could be an email from the employer saying that they got in contact with somebody at work and need to isolate. It could be the email from the school saying that the school was closed, so they have to stay home with their child. You know, it could be any type of documentation.
Must the sickness in question be COVID-19? Or could they be sick with something else to get the benefit?
If they are sick, it has to be COVID-19, but it could also be symptoms similar to those of COVID-19, and thus the person is asked to isolate, yes.
So they would have to provide some documentation to show that they were asked to self-isolate.
Correct.
On the caregiving benefit, what documentation would a claimant have to provide to prove that a family member was in need of care?
So again, it could be an email from the school indicating that a particular class cannot attend the school because there was a case of COVID-19 in the classroom. It could be a daycare closure. Again, an email to parents saying that the daycare has to close and therefore the child cannot attend. It could be a facility that a family member was attending. You know what I'm saying, yeah.
Now, that benefit extends over 40 weeks, right?
For the Canada Recovery Caregiving Benefit, yes, 42 weeks.
Schools don't typically close for, or at least we don't expect schools to be closing for over 40 weeks. If they close because of an outbreak, it's usually for a couple of weeks. Yet the benefit goes for almost a year. Why is that?
Don't forget that the benefit also applies for children that could be attending daycares, and we have seen cases where daycares have been unable to open at all because of reduced demand for caregiving spaces.
Because of a reduced demand for caregiving spaces. What do you mean by that?
So with parents working from home, some parents may choose to keep their child at home and therefore are not requesting the caregiving spaces that they used to, and because of that, daycares may not feel the need or have the capacity to be able to open and operate.
Because so you're saying that there are daycares closing because there's not enough demand for them?
Well, I'm just highlighting a hypothetical situation. I'm not basing this on any evidence. But I'm just pointing to a potential case where you could have the daycare that used to be available, for whatever reason, the daycare cannot open. Either it's a lockdown in a region and the daycare cannot open. There could be a number of reasons.
And is it Mr. Poliev? We are moving to the Liberals. Madame Chatel for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just like my colleague mentioned, I think it's important to note that the officials that are working on C2 are people who work very hard, and they're here to answer our questions. That said, there are important questions that were raised that don't necessarily relate to C2, but that are still interesting. For example, Mr. Blakey's questions regarding the provinces. What are the provinces doing? How will they align with our legislation? There are also questions that are not related to the finance department, like my colleague, Mr. Stewart, asked earlier, regarding the cost of the administration of these programs. There are also questions about post-verification that were asked by Mr. Poilievre. So as a new member of the committee, I looked into the procedures that could be followed to help my colleagues find specific answers to their questions. So we're able to submit our questions in advance. So if we have questions that go beyond the scope of the... so this is something I did yesterday. It can make the work of our officials a little bit easier. So, Mr. Blakey, I would invite you to follow this process. I have a question regarding to workers who might have to reimburse subsidies or benefits for one reason or another. Maybe they didn't have a right to this support. So what is the strategy associated to these reimbursements? So this question is for Madame Demers. Is there a strategy to avoid what happened where taxpayers had to reimburse benefits that they'd collected? Thank you for the question. Yes, there are strategies. There's an entire approach that allows us to put in place some follow-ups that were planned from the start when these support programs were announced. We knew the urgency of offering this help quickly in a very particular situation, and we knew that the government would have to do follow-up and verification after to make sure that all the payments were warranted. So there is a process that will be managed by CRA. So I won't answer in their stead, as this is really something that falls under their purview. But yes, there is a process to do this. It would allow us to take into consideration also the ability to pay. Thank you very much. I have another question for you, Madame Demers. With regards to payment of benefits, we saw that some benefits payments had repercussions on other benefits that were collected by vulnerable groups. For example, guaranteed wage subsidies. So how does C2 tackle this to avoid these issues that we saw with other benefits? With regards to effect on other benefits, this is beyond what is in the bill. So I won't venture into this territory because it's not under my purview. But about the new benefits for lockdowns, and also the extension of the current benefit programs, there are eligibility criteria that were reinforced. So at this stage, we have a better ability to verify the revenue that would allow someone to be admissible to benefits. There are measures like those. And then other criteria will also be applied that will allow us to verify eligibility in advance, whether it be for revenue, workplace location, that the requester is in a lockdown region, and then the matter of the minimum revenue that's required.
Thank you. We're going to thank you, Madame Chatel. And now we're going to be moving over to the block, Madame Sinclair Deganet. That threw me off. So I'm going to practice all night.
Super.
Excellent. That's wonderful. We have so many hours this week. I would like to continue on the same path as my earlier questions and those from my dear colleague, Mr. Baker. It seems as though the criteria for tourism and hospitality, the Department of Finance used mainly the fact that sanitary public health measures have particularly affected this sector. Have we collected data on other sectors that are also affected by these restrictions, like tourism and hospitality? Do we use any other criteria beyond public health measures? Thank you for the question. I can start, and my colleague will jump in if there's anything to add. As I mentioned earlier, as far as we know, there are businesses that are facing major difficulties in all areas of the economy. This is what the claim data and wage subsidies and rent subsidies, etc., are all going up. People are continuing to make requests for support. Great. So I understand that other sectors are also affected and other criteria were considered. With that in mind, did we consider the fact that supply chains are completely blocked, that in manufacturing, they are experiencing problems that are just as important as tourism and heritage and hospitality? I would say that yes. I think that the two programs apply to all industries. Like my colleague mentioned earlier, there was an assumption that tourism was a special case. And so this is what we announced, that the tourism sector was hard hit by public health restrictions. And that's why this program. Thank you. Thank you, Madame Sinclair Legagné.
And Mr. Blakey.
Given that in the tourism and hospitality industry and cultural industries, there are so many self-employed workers, why did the government decide not to have a program like CERB that could provide financial support for workers in those sectors? Mr. Chair, maybe I can start with the first part of the answer. Maybe my colleagues at Finance will want to jump in as well. So in this case, we have very targeted benefits. And these are targeted to lockdown situations. These apply absolutely to self-employed workers. This allows us to extend access to support for these workers that wouldn't necessarily have access to other forms of financial support in a context where they experience a major loss of revenue or have to stop working altogether. Other work is being done beyond the topic of today. We're trying to organize consultations and to analyze the situation in order to develop solutions that would help self-employed workers. This could relate to employment insurance, but this goes beyond the scope of today's discussion. I'm just trying to say that we're working on other things. inaudible to the interpreter. So the government recognizes that in tourism, hospitality, and cultural sectors, there is a problem. These industries have still not recovered to the levels prior to the pandemic, and they have specific needs. So how is it that employees need help, but self-employed people in these same industries don't need the same support? It makes no sense.
We are now moving to the Conservatives and Mr. Stewart for 5 minutes. Oh, is it Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, Mr. McLean for 5 minutes.
That's okay. Thank you. One of the notes that's quite clear in the documents here, we're extending the Canada Recovery Benefit Act for 2 years, for payments to come out of this for 2 years until 2026. So we're extending the benefit programs by 7 months, and we're extending the benefit period to pay it out of by 2 years. Can somebody please explain that rationale for me?
So I can answer the question, Catherine, if you want. That date that it is being extended from, I believe it was the end of March 2024 to the end of March 2026, it's to allow for any activity with respect to the administration of the Act. So it could be post-verification activities, it could be activities that are taking place, many years down the road to reconcile payments, recovery activities, etc., done by the CRA to administer this act. So it's really to allow more time for those activities to take place. And with the extension of the benefits, it was recognized that additional time would be beneficial, and that's why that end date is being extended.
Well, I appreciate that 7 months you'd have to extend what you foresaw previously by 7 months. I don't understand why all the programming that had to go out in the period spanning an extra 3 years post-benefit last time has to be extended by another 2 years when you're extending the benefit coverage periods by only 7 months. So I don't get clarity in your answer there. It just seems like it's a rationale. So I'm going to follow on lines of where my colleague took us here earlier, and that is, at what point in time here did this become something that you were seized with the department? Was this given to you as far as a project, a slush fund, if you will, which is what this seems to be to me now? There's no parameters around how it's paid, when it's paid definitionally, and even the extension of the time period here seems rather egregious. So rationale here matters in a bill such as this, and we are putting you to the test of justifying the numbers, the definitions, and of course the timelines for this programming, none of which have been provided here. So please tell us how you got to where you are as far as this draft goes, because it doesn't seem like it follows a logical pattern.
Mr. Chair, I can respond with respect to Part 2 and Part 3. This suite of measures that are proposed here are very much proposed in the context of understanding where we were in September with the ending of the recovery benefits, which were really meant for specific purpose, addressing the slowdown of the economy as a result of the COVID-19 crisis and loss of employment, massive loss of employment that happened as a result. The benefits were there for a specific reason, a specific time, to support those workers impacted economically by the pandemic. What is proposed here in terms of supports for workers is really looking at the transition from a situation where it's having to address mass layoffs, which we're no longer in, but in a situation where you could still have pockets, communities across the country, for example, pockets where workers are indeed still under in a situation where there's a lockdown, where there are restrictions
Mr.
impacting
Chair.
their work.
Yeah, and I appreciate the intent. What I'm looking at here, and the first question was, suddenly we're extending these benefits for 2 years past where they were before. And somehow I'm getting no clarity on the rationale for how we arrived at a lot of these things. Definitionally, monetarily, it is just a piggy bank saying, here's a blank check, go out and deliver. And please show me something where that is not, that perception isn't spot on.
Okay, that is the time, Mr. McLean, but thank you. And we're moving to the Liberals, to Mr. McDonald for 5 minutes. This will be the end of our fourth round. I am looking to members to think about if we want to go into a fifth round. It will be a truncated fifth round, but you have the floor right now, Mr. McDonald, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And Chair, thinking back over a time period of COVID-19 and how government responded so quickly in such an unprecedented, difficult time. There was no plan in place. There was no rule book. There was an expedition to make sure people had a safe place to lay their head down at night and food on their table in the morning. And I think the government and this individuals represented here today deserve credit for that. Have we learned something, Chair, over that time period? Of course we have. But has it evolved and ever since changing as we go forward? It certainly has. If you take the tourism industry in Prince Edward Island, it's almost 7% of our GDP. So it's extremely important for us to ensure that this bill gets the attention it does and not falls by the wayside of bureaucratic process and concern. But I will ask, many small tourism and hospitality businesses and PEI that did not initially qualify, for whether it was low revenue or seasonality, what changes have been made to this program to ensure that they don't fall through the cracks?
So as I understand the question, it relates to tourism-related businesses that are seasonal and what protections are available under the measures in Part 1 of the bill in order to reflect seasonality. Since we're starting with the Tourism and Hospitality Recovery Program, I would note that the 12-month revenue decline test looks to the months during which the business was ordinarily in operation. And so if you have a seasonal tourism business that is not typically in operation for the entire year, then you'd only look to the months of the year during which it was being run. And so that provides a truer picture of the yearly income of that business. Of course, there are the existing rules that under the wage and rent subsidy programs that the tourism and hospitality program is based upon, where entities are free to elect alternative reference periods for their month-over-month revenue declines, and they also have the month-to-month deeming rule that can allow them to smooth out some of their revenue declines. So these taken together and some flexibility for these seasonal businesses, including in the tourism and hospitality area.
Thank you. And just curious, what public health considerations went into the development of this legislation?
Well, I can speak to some of the measures in Part 1 of the bill, in particular the local lockdown program, that is intended to respond and provide a higher level of subsidization where entities are subject to a lockdown, and that could extend even to the wage subsidy, whereas lockdown support was previously provided only in respect of the rent program, which was based upon a a physical location being locked down. And so you've seen an extension in this bill of the response to lockdowns to go beyond rental payments made where a physical location is locked down to where an entity itself, so a corporation or even an individual sole proprietor's business is subject to lockdown orders. So there's an expansion responding to public health orders designed to protect people in that as well, beyond the rent subsidy.
And just another note, we have a lot of temporary foreign workers on Prince Edward Island. So the owners of those businesses that the temporary foreign workers work for, do they have access to these programs?
There are requirements for the work to be in Canada, and of course for the wage subsidy, there would be a requirement that wages are paid under an employee-employer relationship, and so. And in addition, there under the rent subsidy, it would be possible for a business that uses temporary foreign labor to obtain rent subsidies, and that could extend to mortgage costs and property taxes as well.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald, Mr. McGowan. Now we have concluded our fourth round. To go into a fifth round. I have got a friendly request from our member. Monsieur Sainte-Marie, that we tack on the 10 minutes that we lost this morning with the officials due to rebooting our phones to this round. And if members, I'll look to members to see if they're okay with it. Yes, okay. So we will move into a fifth round, and we will commence with the Conservatives for 5 minutes. Who will be? Okay, Mr. Stewart.
Sorry, Mr. Chair.
No, go ahead.
Sorry,
I caught you off guard.
No, that's okay. One of the questions I asked earlier, which I still think is, there's a lot of good questions that were asked today, and I think they're all equally important. But earlier I asked how much it's going to cost to administer this program, $7.4 billion suite of funds that's going to be doled out. And I asked how much it would cost to administer it. And I never got an answer. I wonder if in that time, if somebody has done the due diligence and found that answer. Any witness can answer that question. Feel free.
As I indicated, we committed to try and provide the answer as a follow up along with the other answers.
Okay, so just for clarification, there was another question I asked at that time. I asked if the amount to administer. Actually, let me ask this question: is there a cost associated, an extra cost associated with the doling out of the $7.4 billion?
As I indicated, that my understanding is it's part of the 7.4, but that needs to be confirmed and would be confirmed when the answer is provided.
But to my question is there actually an added cost? You have clarified twice now that the cost is within it, but I'm still trying to figure out why witnesses would show up here today without that very important information. I mean, you want us to shovel through $7.4 billion that basically anybody in Canada could claim that they were sick and not be sick and achieve the benefit with little to nothing from a doctor or, I'm just shocked that we don't have an answer to that. Another question I have is, will this negatively impact the programs and other programs and the delivery of those programs? considering the size and magnitude of the $7.4 billion.
Mr. Chair, maybe I can, if that's okay, I can respond for part of the questions related to costing for the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit, which is in a different situation than the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit in terms of estimation of costs. For the sickness and the caregiving benefit, we are estimating a total of $1.8 billion in benefits to be paid for a total of 890,000 potential individual claimants. So those are the cost estimates. Those are estimates because it really depends on the intake for the benefit. Should it be needed with closures of schools, institutions, and a rise in COVID cases. For the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit, again, it's really important to understand that the costing is directly dependent on the triggering of those benefits in designated regions. Should there be designated lockdown regions where workers would be needing the benefit, the cost would then depend on whether those situations occur, the length of the scope, the length of the actual lockdown in the community. So as we move forward, we will be in a better position to provide those projections and to report on those costing estimates. This for the lockdown benefit, I should say.
Okay. I appreciate that answer. And hopefully tomorrow we'll have some answers on the total cost to administer the program, and looking forward to it. That's all my questions for now.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stewart. And we're moving to the Liberals and Ms. Zarowitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to ask, and I don't know if there's any officials that are available to respond to this, but in the section around the amendments to the Income Tax Act and the COVID business supports, we talk about enhancing and extending the Canada Recovery Hiring Program, which I'm excited about. I think it is something that as a replacement for the wage subsidy, I think that this has been very helpful to employers. I wonder if there's anyone who is joining us today from finance who's able to respond as to the take-up of this program, the Canada Recovery Hiring Program, and how it's actually been helpful in terms of ensuring more that businesses are able to hire the workers that they need in order to continue to succeed as a business.
Yes, well, maybe I can answer that one. Well, indeed, the intent, we've talked a lot about pivoting and moving to the sort of the more restrained support programs, which are the tourism and hospitality and the hard-hit businesses. But also the notion is, as you rightly point out, a lot of the businesses are recovering, but not all of them are recovering in the same way. And the Canada Recovery Hiring Program allows for those that are recovering and starting to rehire, but maybe not all the way back, that still have revenue losses vis-a-vis where they were pre-pandemic, to get a subsidy to hire workers more or less. I'm going to generalize here, but more or less to the levels that they were at the time of the budget. So, and that program is now being extended, and the idea there, of course, is for those businesses that have started to recover, that don't need the support that they were getting previously, but that are starting to recover, then they can continue to get a subsidy. Now, in terms of the take-up numbers for that program, as you know, for both the wage subsidy and the rent subsidy, the CRA provides a very detailed tracking on their website on the number of claims and on the number of applicants and whatnot, and that information is publicly available. The intent is to do the same thing with the Canada Recovery Program once all of that data is available and can be put up. So that will be available once that's there.
And if I can ask a follow-up, so this program is available not only to those in the tourism and hospitality industry or the hardest hit industry, it's open to any employer. Can you just confirm that?
Yep, that is correct. My colleague Yves Poirier can maybe add to that, but yes, that's.
No, that's okay. Simple yes or no is good. I'm good on that. And then also, it says here it's available for all eligible employers with the current revenue loss above 10%. Has that changed from before? Is that consistent with the program that had been introduced previously? And we're just extending the availability of this program.
That again, I think Mr. Poirier could confirm, but yes, that is my understanding.
Okay, excellent. Well, that's great. I think it'll be I know it's been helpful to a lot of businesses in Davenport, and I think it'll continue to be very helpful. How many minutes do I have left?
You've got 40 seconds.
Oh, 40 seconds. Maybe in my 40 seconds, I can ask about the recovery benefits. So the sickness benefit as well as the caretaking benefit. I know that we're extending it by 2 weeks, and I wouldn't mind understanding the rationale of why not 3 weeks or 1 week, just sort of understanding what was the rationale of landing on the 2 weeks. That would be helpful to know. Thank you.
So for the additional weeks, we have looked at a number of factors. These benefits have been available since September 25th, 2020. And a number of Canadians have, for good reason, they necessitated that support and have reached a maximum number of weeks that were available under those benefits. It's not a very high percentage of those who have exhausted, but still it's to make it available for them.
Thank you very much. Now we're moving to the bloc. Madame Sinclair Desganay.
Oui, merci.
Thank you. So I'm looking for a specific answer in the time that I have left from the Department of Finance. Inflation is not the only worldwide issue that we're facing. There's also supply chain issues. Factories have closed, production is down, notably in the manufacturing industry, and then there are issues with maritime transportation. So again, many businesses are suffering just as much as tourism and hospitality because of the pandemic. Can we expect that these sectors who also meet the criteria, for example, a 40% loss of revenue, would these businesses be able to access help as well if they meet the criteria? I'm just looking for a yes. I'd like to try to answer the question. I don't know if it answers perfectly. So we have a program for hospitality and tourism, and there are criteria associated to that program. For those who don't fall under this definition, there is a program for the hard-hit businesses. So if I understand correctly, if businesses are suffering as much as the tourism and hospitality sector, they don't have rights to as much support from the government. If they don't fit within the definition of that program, indeed, they cannot benefit from the program. But as we mentioned earlier, if they are in a local lockdown, then they could access the same types of support. I understand. Thank you.
We're moving now to the NDP. Mr. Blakey for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. One of the big problems for a lot of seniors who are guaranteed income supplement recipients and who did work according to the rules of the program to top up their income is that CERB payments that they received are now being clawed back effectively by reducing their guaranteed income supplement. This is happening also to low-income families on the Canada Child Benefit who have likewise seen their pandemic benefit payments clawed back through the CCB program this year. I'm wondering if the government has taken any measures in the Act to avoid this happening again by stipulating in the legislation, for instance, that Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit income will not be included in the eligibility calculation for income-tested programs like the Guaranteed Income Supplement and the Canada Child Benefit.
So representing ESDC, what I can say, Mr. Blakey, is that I can return with these questions to colleagues in my department who are responsible for those programs. This is not an area that is under my purview, but can say that there is work underway and that we can provide a follow-up response.
There's nothing in the bill that addresses this issue. Is that a fair assessment?
So with respect to supports for workers, we've talked about some of the integrity measures that are.
I just mean there's nothing in the bill that would ensure that payments under the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit are not included in income eligibility calculations for the GIS, the Canada Child Benefit, or other income-tested programs of the federal government.
I believe there is nothing in the bill.
Okay, so despite...
I can confirm there's nothing in Part 1 of the bill that, that relates to that.
Thank you for a clear answer. I appreciate that. I am disappointed given the fact that it's been an issue for months now, that the government says they're working on a solution, that there is no solution in the bill. But I take it to mean then that the solution for this is possible without any legislation. The government could actually do this by regulation. Is that also fair?
Thank you, Mr. Blakey. Thank you. And now we're moving to the Conservatives. Mr. Chambers for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We talked a little bit about I had the opportunity to ask a little bit about procedure and process. I just would like to confirm, make sure I understand this correctly. Did we learn any lessons that resulted in procedure changes in terms of the process and procedure to dispense funds to applicants between the earlier program supports and this support? So have we made any procedure changes based on anything that we learned?
I can speak to the COVID measures in Part 1 of the bill, like the wage subsidy and rent subsidy, and say, as I noted earlier, there have been a number of iterative changes improving on the programs. One of them procedurally in terms of applicants has been the measures that would allow a process for objection or provide a clear process for objection and determination of an amount of an entitlement from an applicant for the wage or rent subsidies under the Income Tax Act, so that they can make an application, get a decision by the Canada Revenue Agency, and then have a clear process for redress instead of, say, for example, launching a judicial review. And that's something that we've heard has been helpful for both the taxpayers and the Canada Revenue Agency in preparing a clear process to help ensure their rights of appeal are clear and followed.
Okay. Thank you very much. With respect to effectiveness of some programs, obviously we want to make sure, and this committee would like to make sure, that the programs that it recommends or blesses in legislation are effective. I think it is helpful to consider how effective existing programs have been. in supporting those affected. I assume we might not have this stat here today. I'll ask the question anyway. If it is unavailable, I would ask that it be provided with the other documents or information requested, which is, can we have an update on the uptake of the Canada Recovery Hiring Program? That is, how many applicants have been made, how many people has that helped? That would be very helpful in understanding how effective some of these programs have been.
Yeah, just quickly to note, as I indicated in a previous answer, the Canada Revenue Agency, as I say, has released numbers on their website for the wage subsidy, for the rent subsidy. It's available, and I understand the intent is when it's available to be doing the same for the hiring program. Which I believe is the one you're asking about, if I understand.
No, that's correct. And I certainly appreciate the difficulty it sometimes is to get the information. However, we're being asked to approve some additional measures to help people. I think it would be very helpful for this committee, the members of the committee, to understand how effective some of the current programs are before we recommend additional programs. So I hope that information would be made available in short order to this committee and to these members with our responsibility to consider how effective future spending might be. So we can add that to the list, Mr. Chair, of the request of information, and certainly hope, if that information exists, that it would be made available forthwith. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we're moving to our last questioner for the fifth round, and this is also going to conclude this third meeting. We've got Mr. Baker, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm honored. J'aimerais...
I would like to ask a few questions about the criteria that businesses might meet in order to receive aid. In the bill, there are many programs. Most of them depend on a lost revenue for businesses, 40%, 50%, etc. Here's what I'd like to ask. What approach did you use to determine the percentage of lost revenue that's appropriate? Like we said earlier, the idea was to target businesses and organizations that were hardest hit at this part of the pandemic. So now we're moving into more targeted programs. That's how we establish the criteria. So the first is to establish if they were hard.
So the average of 12 months, of the last 12 months, if there is a loss of 40% for tourism and hospitality and 50% for hardest hit businesses. And secondly, to make sure that businesses still need the help, 40% and 50% respectively, for the current month. Now, for these thresholds, we engage with stakeholders to see what would be reasonable, to define who is the hardest hit. So we try to find a balance between a targeted approach between the people that have been the hardest hit. And we talked about the Canada Recovery Program for these businesses that are recovering, but still not at a pre-pandemic level. So there is a hiring program, and we are talking about a threshold of less than 10% to start to be eligible for the subsidy. And that is to encourage businesses that are recovering at this stage. So I hope this answers the question. How much time do I have left, Mr. Chair? So what I'm hearing is that we are trying to target businesses that have been the hardest hit. Obviously, there is specific help for tourism. That's a very hard-hit sector. There are also programs for businesses in all sectors of the economy. So if a business has been hit, they will be able to get some help, even though they are not in the tourism sector. I asked that question because another question was asked earlier for businesses outside of the tourism sector. So what I understand from your answer is that help is offered in other programs. Yes, if they qualify for the hardest hit businesses program or for the hiring program, yes, they will get help.
Conclude our fifth round of questions. Just on behalf of this committee, I want to thank the officials for coming before us, for answering many of the questions, also for their commitment to getting us some of the information that has been requested. We thank you for that. Members, just want to let you know, so tomorrow in our fourth meeting, we'll be looking at having stakeholders come before us in the afternoon, and then the minister on Thursday morning. So on that, shall we adjourn? Yes. Adjourn. Hold the gap.